Many of you have seen this, but have you seen this? The second one, 1941. An animation studio at the time tried to walk away from that project, a deal they deliberately tried to sabotage, and 17 cartoons that accidentally wrote the visual rulebook that everyone else has been following for 80 plus years. By 1940, Superman was everywhere. Action Comics had introduced him just 2 years earlier, and already he commanded a nationwide radio serial and a syndicated newspaper strip read by millions of Americans every morning. Paramount Pictures noticed. They approached Max and Dave Fleischer, the team behind Betty Boop and Popeye, some of the most successful animated franchises in history, with a straightforward proposal. Bring the Man of Steel to the screen. Dave Fleischer didn't want the job. And it wasn't just a technical problem, it was an identity problem for the studio and for the entire medium. Animation in 1940 meant one thing in short theatrical form. It meant funny animals. It meant rubber-hosed limbs and characters whose anatomy existed to serve a gag. Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Porky Pig, Popeye, Betty Boop, every significant short-form animated character in the history of the medium had been built around comedy, around the idea that animation's specific power was exaggeration in service of a laugh. Serious animation before this did actually exist. The earliest known example was by Winsor McKay. He had made a devastating animation documentary about the Louisiana in 1918. And considering the year it came out, it's still quite impressive to see today, and it's also in the public domain, so definitely check that out. Snow White had released just a few years earlier, and had proven that audiences would genuinely fear for hand-drawn animated characters being in trouble, and taking that sort of thing seriously. But Snow White still had the Seven Dwarfs, it still had the silly songs, it still had the comedy escape hatch built into the architecture of the film. After all, it was meant to be something for everyone to enjoy, both young and old. And it also was a feature. The short theatrical slot, so the 7 or so minute gap between the newsreel and the main picture, that more or less belonged to comedy. No one ever asked animation to sustain dramatic tension with nothing to fall back on, no funny sidekick, no gag to break the stakes. Also, animating a realistic human figure, so in the case of Superman, someone muscular, proportioned, physically convincing, is one of the most technically demanding challenges in the medium. The Fleischer Studio had been built on rubber hose exaggeration, on characters whose anatomy responded to comedy, not physics. Superman was the opposite of everything that they did well. So Dave did what any responsible person does when they want to exit a conversation without burning a relationship. He named a price that he assumed would end it, $100,000 per cartoon, so roughly $2.3 million in 2026 dollars. During an era when the industry average for high-quality animated short was roughly $25,000 to $30,000 depending on the studio, a little bit less in some of the more budget ones. He was asking for roughly 4 times the standard rate. But to the Fleischer's absolute shock, Paramount actually agreed. Now, one common misconception is that each of these shorts cost $100,000 to make. Well, no. The two sides did eventually negotiate down to $50,000 for the pilot, which included things like R&D, special effects tests, that sort of thing, and then $30,000 for each subsequent short. But still, the answer was yes, and now the Fleischers had to deliver. What happened next surprised everyone, including almost certainly the Fleischers themselves. They exceeded expectations significantly. The budget showed, so all that money you could see right on the screen. The rotoscoping used showed the sheer physical weight of the animation, the way Superman moved through space with genuine mass and consequence, and it was unlike anything audiences had seen in a theatrical short, but the technical demands of the format were creating a problem no one had anticipated. In the comics at the time, Superman didn't fly, he leaped. Incredible distances, yes, so he was still a Superman, but as soon as he left the ground, he just came back down, and that was the original power set. He was also incredibly strong too, but not strong like he would be in the decades later in the 1950s. On the comic book page, it looked fine, it looked actually quite good, but in fluid motion, the animators discovered very quickly it looked completely absurd. So they actually ended up making a decision, and they ended up making him fly. And unlike today, where if you were to change this sort of thing, you would have to jump through so many hoops and go through so many editorial departments, there was just no consultation, they just did it. The Fleischers just made him fly, and that was it. The animators looked at the problem, identified the solution, they implemented it, and That decision, born from the technical limitations of translating a static medium into a moving one, became permanent Superman canon. Now, some of you in the comments, before you mention it, yes, I am aware that the radio show did describe Superman flying first, but the Fleischer shorts were the first time that Superman was actually seen flying. And it's actually quite fascinating to see between the comics, the radio show, the newspaper strip, and now the cartoon, how bits and pieces of each would end up contributing in some way to the Superman canon that we all know today. One change that the shorts actually did do, and it completely originated, it was the phone booth change. And that's a major iconic image of Superman, changing from Clark Kent to Superman in a phone booth. And it was the Fleischer shorts that did that. It's not as though when the writers, directors, and animators were doing this, they were saying to themselves, oh, we're going to create this wonderful addition to the pop culture zeitgeist. No, they just had to work. So they needed to create solutions to story problems. How is Clark Kent going to become Superman? And they just had him change into a phone booth, and that's an image that's stuck since and had become a staple in the comic books not long after. But what the Fleischers also did was cast two actors that people would have already known through the Superman radio show. So Bud Collyer and Joan Alexander. So Bud Collyer did Superman and Clark Kent, and Joan Alexander did Lois Lane. So while there was no continuity between the radio show and this series of shorts, it does create an interesting bit of continuity when it comes to the vocals. So when the short was first released, the audiences loved what they saw, but unlike today where we could look back and go, oh, this is the first phone booth change, or oh look, he's flying now, and piecing together the evolution of the character, the audiences were entertained. They didn't think anything otherwise. But here's where the story gets interesting. The studio didn't want the job, they had been dragged into it by negotiation that backfired. They had to figure out what their version of Superman actually looked like, and they made a decision which in retrospect defined everything. If you've read the earlier Superman comics, it's actually comics number 1 and so on, Superman was often a champion of the oppressed. He would be fighting corrupt politicians, he would be fighting street thugs. So he was just a Superman, so just an extra strong guy, essentially just beating up people that he thought were doing the wrong thing. But the Fleischer shorts completely abandoned that grounded approach. In these shorts, Superman isn't busting mobsters and solving crimes. What the Fleischers built instead was something closer to disaster films. So they did 9 shorts, so that was all produced under their banner. Each one is essentially the same premise, executed at a different scale. An existential threat arrives, and one man stands between it and the city. What changes between the entries is the nature of the threat, and the Fleischers, freed from the constraints of grounding the stories in human-level stakes, use that freedom to go as large as the budget would allow. So you'd have a Godzilla-scaled dinosaur terrorizing Metropolis. You have a gang with a flying, bullet-shaped craft capable of destroying city infrastructure on a single pass. A villain operating a massive underwater apparatus attempting to sink Metropolis entirely. And these are not really superhero stories in the modern sense. These are more akin to pulp science fiction at full volume, the kind of scenarios that belonged on the cover of a 1940s paperback. The Fleischers took the visual language that spent a decade refining on Popeye and Betty Boop and pointed it at the largest possible canvas. But the entry that matters most, and the one that reaches furthest beyond its own era, is this one. The Mechanical Monsters, released in 1941. You've got flying robots, jewel thieves, and a villain operating a mechanical army from a private fortress. And the design language is precise, industrial, angular, genuinely threatening in a way that most 1940s antagonists simply aren't. Decades later, a Japanese animator named Hayao Miyazaki would cite this film, this specific film, as a direct visual reference for his robot guardians in Castle in the Sky. And if you haven't seen that, definitely do so. It's a wonderful film. The Fleischer Studio was already gone by the time Miyazaki was born. The people who designed these robots almost certainly never knew their work would travel that far. But the visual grammar they established in these shorts cross an ocean, cross 4 decades, and show up in one of the most celebrated animated films ever made. And that is the shape of what the Fleischers built during this period. Not a franchise, not a mythology in the deliberate sense, just a body of visual decisions made under pressure, made quickly, or relatively quickly for that matter, and made by people who were solving immediate problems in front of them that just turned out to be permanent. None of them sat there and thought, this is going to be our magnum opus, we're going to create some of the greatest animation ever made. No, this was a job to them. They came in, they did their job, they went home. They weren't thinking decades later people would still be talking about this stuff. So the Man vs. Colossus template they leaned into so heavily wasn't a creative manifesto, and it was just a practical answer to a specific question. How do you make a realistic human figure feel extraordinary against a static background? You make the background move, you make it enormous, and you make him, Superman, the only thing standing in front of it. Every entry in this period is a variation on that solution. Billion Dollar Limited runs it at train speed. Volcano runs it against natural disaster. Terror on the Midway runs it at night, in a circus, against a gorilla the size of a building, with animation that is frame for frame some of the moodiest work the studio ever produced, or any studio for that matter during this period of time. So you had 9 shorts, 9 applications of the same underlying logic, and then in 1942, everything changed. By this point, the falling out between Max and Dave Fleischer had been building for years. By 1941, the same year their Superman shorts were drawing the best reviews of their careers, the two brothers had effectively stopped speaking to each other. Decades of shared work, shared credit, shared pressure had produced a professional relationship that was, by any honest measure, broken. Paramount had been watching. The studio had significant financial leverage over the Fleischers. Debt accumulated across the years of production, the kind that gives accreditor options when they choose to exercise them. And in 1941, with a fractured leadership team running the most expensive ongoing production, Paramount chose to exercise them. Max and Dave Fleischer were forced out of their own company. The studio that they had built, the one that had given the world Betty Boop, Popeye, and now Superman, was reorganized, rebranded, and handed to Paramount's own management. The new name was Famous Studios. And with that name change, the experiment shifted. The world in 1942 was at war, and Famous Studios, under new management, with a slashed budget and a very different set of priorities, made a decision that anyone running a wartime entertainment property would have made. They essentially drafted Superman. The sci-fi spectacle of the Fleischer era, the mechanical monsters, the glacier dinosaurs, and the armored trains were set aside almost immediately. The new productions had a different brief. Superman was now a propaganda vehicle, and the 8 Famous Studio entries that completed the series reflect, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what they meant. So Sabotage, the very first Famous Studio entry, and a film that set the new tone without ambiguity. Heavily caricatured Japanese spies, a hijacked bomber. The visual language of the wartime anxiety is seen here in full effect. What's immediately apparent, even on a single viewing, is what's gone. The physical weight that defined the Fleischer era, the rotoscope mass, and the consequence of the animation isn't quite there. The design language is flatter. The sense of scale that made the mechanical monsters feel genuinely threatening has been replaced with something more functional, efficient, and considerably less memorable. The series continued in this register, so you had the 11th Hour sends Clark and Lois to Japan to sabotage the war effort directly. Jungle Drums places Lois in captivity in the jungle. Destruction Incorporated and Secret Agent complete this wartime cycle. Scattered between them are entries that take a step away from the propaganda framework. Showdown, where a criminal dresses up as a fake Superman to rob jewelers. The Mummy Strikes goes back into that pulp fantasy and ends up being one of the ones more closer to the Fleischer entries. The Underground World, which involves a subterranean race of Hawkmen. While some of these shorts are hard to watch due to the wartime references, these shorts actually aren't that bad as long as you put them in the appropriate context and if you assess them honestly as products of their time. They're competently made. And if you're someone that's into World War II history, they're definitely fascinating to see how animation was deployed in wartime. But these entries certainly weren't like the ones that came before it. So the series was cancelled in 1943. Paramount cited 2 reasons: declining interest from theatrical exhibitors in the format, and the cost. In my opinion, given that the war was raging on, audiences would have likely have preferred to have some true escapism by seeing some, again, funny cartoon animals. And Bugs Bunny was rising around this time too, so they would have probably gotten more of a kick out of that anyway. But all 17 shorts had consumed, by Paramount's own accounting, over $500,000. Even with Famous Studios cutting some corners, the numbers no longer worked. The Man of Steel had exited theatrical animation quietly. No finale, no send-off. A final short was completed, distributed, and then nothing. The format had run for 2 years, and some of the most technically ambitious animation of the time simply stopped. But for decades after the cancellation in 1943, they weren't locked away in a vault. They were everywhere. They were broadcast on independent television stations and packaged onto cheap, unrestored VHS tapes, just sold pretty much everywhere. Drugstores, service stations, supermarkets, that sort of thing. And a massive generation of children growing up in the 1970s and 80s discovered these cinematic masterpieces through scratchy, muddy, 3rd or 5th or whatever generation video transfers. But the sheer quality of the animation shone through, and one of these viewers was animator Bruce Timm. When he and his team were tasked with developing Batman in the Animated Series in the 1990s, they looked directly at this series of shorts. This show is by any serious assessment one of the finest pieces of American animation ever produced. I'm a huge fan as well. I've watched this show many times and it still thrills today, as it did when I was a kid growing up in the 90s. It is also, and this is documented, so I'm not speculating here, it is built directly on the foundation that the Fleischer Studio had poured in 1941. Bruce Timm and his team looked at the Art Deco architecture, the duotone shadow work, the weight of the figure animation, the way the Fleischer shorts use scale, placing one extraordinary figure against an overwhelming industrial environment to generate tension without dialogue. What Timm and his team did, what they understood that the intervening 40 years had largely missed, was that the Fleischer aesthetic wasn't a product of its era. It wasn't nostalgia, it was a design system, rigorous, coherent, and portable across any story that needed it. They took the system and they applied it to Gotham City. The result ran for many seasons, redefining what an animated superhero could look like, and launched a shared animated universe which, to this day, is the benchmark against which every subsequent attempt is measured. And ironically, they actually came full circle in using similar techniques when they made their Superman show. None of that happens without those 17 shorts that a studio produced under duress on a negotiated budget for a project that they tried to exit before it began. The Fleischer shorts are in the public domain. You can definitely watch them now for free. They're all on YouTube. There is an officially restored set that's out on Blu-ray. Sadly, they did botch some of the restoration work on that, so if you do want to buy for your collection, buy with caution, but it's also meant other folks have done their own version of restorations which actually look better. Definitely check it out before you commit to buying that set. But I strongly encourage you to watch these if you haven't, because they're genuinely frame-for-frame extraordinary pieces of work. The Mechanical Monsters holds up, $1 Billion Limited holds up, Terror on the Midway holds up in ways that may surprise you, but now you can watch them knowing what you're actually looking at. Every single serious animated TV show that's come out since owes to some degree to this particular series of shorts. And as I've mentioned already, it all came from a studio that didn't want to do these in the first place.
That was a great scoop.
Yes, Chief, thanks to Superman.